On a quiet Sunday morning in the Pacific, the world's most powerful nation slept with absolute confidence. Families prepared for church, sailors polished the rails of their battleships, and officers enjoyed coffee under the warm Hawaiian sun. There was no fear, no warning, no reason to believe that in the next few minutes their lives and the future of the entire world would be changed forever. Because hundreds of miles away, beyond the curve of the earth, a silent armada sliced through the ocean like a shadow of fate. 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, escorted by destroyers and battleships, moved in perfect formation. Nobody on American soil knew they were coming. Nobody even imagined that the first blow of World War II on American territory was already racing toward them at impossible speed. At 6 a.m., in the freezing, windswept darkness above the Pacific, pilots tightened their gloves, whispered prayers, and climbed into cockpits loaded with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Engines roared to life, shaking entire ships. The air vibrated. The deck officers raised their flags, and moments later, plane after plane hurled itself off the carrier decks and vanished into the pink glow of dawn. They weren't heading for a battlefield, they were heading for a paradise named Pearl Harbor. Back in Hawaii, the mood couldn't have been more peaceful. Couples walked along the beach. Children collected shells in the sand. Soldiers laughed in their barracks. And across the harbor, America's mightiest battleships rested in a perfect line. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, floating peacefully like steel mountains under a rising sun. But beneath that calm surface, destiny was already screaming toward them. At 7:55 a.m., every clock on the island froze in time. A sound tore across the sky. First a hum, then a roar, then a thunder that seemed to split the heavens open. People looked up, confused. Sailors stepped onto their decks, squinting into the light. And then they saw them. Dozens of aircraft dropping out of the sky like a storm of steel hawks. Black silhouettes against the morning sun. Engines screaming, wings glinting, bombs already falling. For a fraction of a second, Pearl Harbor held its breath. Then the first explosion hit. The harbor erupted in fire. Battleships trembled. Windows shattered. Flames climbed into the air as smoke poured across the water. In those first brutal seconds, the United States, unprepared, unwarned, and unsuspecting, was pushed into a war that would consume the entire world. But what happened next? What happened in the hours, days, months, and years that followed was not just a response. It was an awakening. The attack that was meant to break America instead forged a giant. And this is the story of that moment. The moment when peace died, when courage was born, and when the future of the 20th century turned on a single Sunday morning. This is the story of Pearl Harbor. On the island of Oahu, the dawn of December 7th, 1941 began with a softness that disguised the violence racing toward it. The sky was still streaked with the pale colors of early morning, a blend of gentle pastels unfolding over the calm Pacific waters that whispered against the sandy beaches. Palm trees swayed lightly in the breeze, and most of the island slept peacefully, unaware that this would be the last calm morning before the world shifted forever. The scent of plumeria drifted through the air, mixing with the salt of the ocean, while at Pearl Harbor, the proud battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet sat quietly at their moorings, reflecting on the surface of the water like giant steel monuments to American power. These ships, Arizona, Oklahoma, Nevada, Tennessee, West Virginia, California, and Maryland, stood side by side, imposing yet serene, their crews waking slowly to another typical Sunday. The night watches were ending, men stretching sleep from their limbs, others preparing for breakfast or leisurely activities. Some sailors wrote letters home, savoring the stillness. Others cleaned the decks, laughing quietly with their friends. They had no reason to suspect that high above them, beyond the reach of vision or imagination, dark shapes were already moving with deliberate purpose. Far across the ocean, beyond the curve of the earth, the Japanese First Air Fleet sliced through the vastness of the Pacific. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku plowed through the water in absolute silence except for the low rumble of their engines. On their decks were hundreds of aircraft, Zeros, Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, lined up in precise rows, each weaponized, fueled, armed, and awaiting orders. The men who stood beside these aircraft had packed their gear carefully, adjusted their goggles, tightened their gloves, and braced themselves for what would be the most consequential mission of their lives. The sea beneath them heaved gently, as if unaware that history was unfolding upon its surface. The pilots' expressions ranged from determination to apprehension. Some muttered prayers under their breath. Others stared ahead with fearless conviction, believing wholeheartedly in the Emperor and the mission. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leader of the first wave, stood with a steely focus. He knew what was at stake. He knew the operation had to be perfect, and he was ready. As the carriers turned into the wind, engines ignited with a thunder that rolled across the decks. One by one, the aircraft lurched forward, gathering speed until the tips of their wheels lifted away from the wooden planks. They rose into the air like shadows being peeled off the ocean, ascending higher and higher until their formations stretched across the morning sky in tight, deadly groups. Their wings shimmered under the rising sun. Their paths were direct, unhesitating, as they advanced toward Oahu through a veil of clouds. The pilots flew with eerie calm. None of them spoke unless necessary. Their training had taught them silence, discipline, precision. As Oahu drew nearer beneath them, a few broke their silence to whisper a final thought, a memory, a hope, a fear, before settling fully into their roles as instruments of war. Down below, the island hummed with peaceful routine. A few fishermen prepared nets along the shore. Children played in their yards, unaware that destruction was approaching through the clouds above. On military bases, the usual Sunday laziness prevailed. At Hickam and Wheeler Fields, pilots slept soundly in their quarters, their aircraft neatly lined up wingtip to wingtip for protection against sabotage, a strategy that would become catastrophic within minutes. At Pearl Harbor, men walked along the decks with cups of coffee, greeting fellow sailors with nods or casual remarks. Some laughed at inside jokes, some cleaned weapons, some played cards. A few planned to attend church within the hour. They were secure in their belief that Pearl Harbor was too far, too protected, too sacred to be touched by war. Fuchida's aircraft broke through the final cloud layer, revealing the harbor below, bathed in sunlight. He looked down at the battleships glistening brightly like jewels set into the blue water. The distance made them seem peaceful, vulnerable, almost unsuspecting, exactly what Japan's strategists had hoped for. He gripped his radio and announced calmly yet triumphantly, "Tora, Tora, Tora." This coded phrase, meaning tiger, signaled that complete surprise had been achieved. With that transmission, the fate of thousands was sealed, and the world shifted irreversibly toward global conflict. The first wave of Japanese planes descended with terrifying speed. Dive bombers screamed downward, their engines roaring so loudly that many sailors thought they were hearing a strange kind of thunder. Torpedo bombers skimmed low over the water, barely above the surface, the spray of the ocean misting their underside as they aligned their attack runs. And then explosions, deafening, shattering explosions that ripped through the peaceful morning like cracks of doom. The first torpedoes slammed into the battleships with a force that sent columns of water rising dozens of feet into the air. Steel bent, hulls ruptured, compartments flooded instantly. The shockwaves traveled through the ships like giant hammer blows, knocking men off balance, hurling them against walls, tearing equipment from their mounts. On the USS Arizona, a bomb pierced the deck and ignited the forward magazine. The resulting explosion was so violent that it tore through the ship with the power of a volcanic eruption. Flames shot upward, debris flew across the harbor, and the entire vessel lifted before collapsing onto itself in a catastrophic inferno. More than 1,000 men died in seconds, many without ever realizing what had happened. Sailors nearby watched in horror as the Arizona dissolved into fire, its once mighty frame breaking apart in a wave of red, orange, and black. Flames engulfed the decks. Smoke billowed skyward like a funeral pyre visible for miles. The shock of this one explosion alone shattered any illusions that the attack might be contained or accidental. This was war, swift, merciless, deliberate. The Oklahoma suffered a similar fate, struck by multiple torpedoes that punched through her hull like giant spears. Water flooded in faster than sailors could react. The ship began to list, then roll over completely, trapping hundreds inside. Men pounded on the walls from within, their fists echoing desperately through the steel. Some were rescued with blowtorches hours later. Many were not. Their cries remained like ghosts inside the hull. The West Virginia took several torpedo hits, listing sharply before settling underwater. The California fought to stay stable, but was overcome by flooding. The Tennessee and Maryland, partially shielded by other ships, suffered damage but continued fighting. From every battleship, machine guns rattled towards the sky, sailors firing at silhouettes they could barely see through the smoke and flames. The gunners were frantic, but the planes moved too quickly, too precisely. Still, they fired, anger and fear fueling their determination. Meanwhile, at the airfields, the devastation was equally brutal. Japanese Zeros strafed the runways, bullets ripping through grounded aircraft that couldn't move an inch. Planes exploded in fiery bursts, sending fragments flying in all directions. Hangars burst into flames. Mechanics and pilots scrambled for cover behind barrels, trucks, and whatever debris they could find. Some sprinted towards the few aircraft that remained intact, trying to get them off the ground before the enemy circled back. Lieutenant Phil Rasmussen, dressed in pajamas and a flight jacket, managed to climb into a P-36 and took off through smoke and fire, becoming one of the few American pilots airborne during the first wave. Against overwhelming odds, he shot down a Japanese fighter. His bravery became the flicker of hope in a morning dominated by chaos. Amid the destruction, ordinary men performed extraordinary acts. Sailors swam through burning oil to pull wounded comrades to safety. Others shielded friends with their bodies as bullets tore through the air. Hospital staff ran through smoke-filled corridors, carrying stretchers, bandaging wounds, injecting morphine, whispering words of comfort. Civilians joined the effort, rushing to donate blood, bringing blankets, helping firefighters battle the infernos, consuming ships and barracks. The attack continued relentlessly. The second wave swept in, hammering already burning targets, dropping bombs on fuel depots and dry docks, strafing anyone who moved. Anti-aircraft guns now barked with rage, the tracers painting streaks of fire through the sky. Some planes were hit, spiraling downward in trails of smoke, but the damage had been done. The harbor was in ruins, the airfields nearly destroyed, and thousands were dead or injured. When the last Japanese plane disappeared over the ocean horizon, Pearl Harbor lay drowning in smoke. Fires burned on the water, ships listed at dangerous angles, bodies floated amid debris. Men walked in shock, their faces smeared with soot and tears, looking for friends who would never answer them again. And far across the Pacific, the message that would change the world had already reached Washington. While flames still licked the shattered hulls of the battleships and thick black smoke rolled upward into the once quiet Hawaiian sky, another kind of darkness settled over the men who had survived the attack, the chilling realization that the world as they knew it had just disappeared. The normal routines of a peaceful Sunday morning had been replaced by a new horrifying landscape of twisted steel, scorched earth, and the acrid smell of burning oil that clung stubbornly to the air, crawling deep into every breath they took. Men coughed violently, wiping soot from their eyes as they stumbled across the docks, searching frantically for familiar faces among the chaos. Every few steps, someone stopped suddenly, staring at a body lying motionless beneath a torn sheet or at a stretch of water bubbling with fire. Some broke down. Others clenched their trembling fists and forced themselves onward, driven by a fierce need to help anyone still alive. Across the harbour, small boats darted through oily, debris-strewn water, their engines sputtering as their drivers manoeuvred desperately to reach sailors clinging to floating wreckage. Many of these rescuers were civilians who had been out fishing that morning, or simply residents living near the shoreline. When the explosion started, they had looked out toward the harbour and seen the sky erupt in flames. Now, without hesitation, they sped toward danger, determined to pull survivors from the inferno. They reached out over the sides of their boats, hauling men aboard, some coughing violently, some limp, some dazed into silence, their eyes wide with shock. The rescuers did not stop to think about what might still be lurking above or beneath the water. They only knew that every second mattered. Meanwhile, inside the overturned hull of the Oklahoma, trapped sailors fought to stay calm as the rising water crept higher up their legs. In utter darkness, they pressed their hands against the steel walls, hoping to find weak spots or openings. Some tapped on the hull using wrenches, hoping rescue teams above could hear them. The tapping echoed eerily across the harbour, a steady rhythm of desperation. Divers who heard the sounds raced to the capsized battleship, using cutting torches to slice through the thick plates of metal. The work was slow, grueling, and dangerous. Flames from the torches hissed and spat against steel, while vapors from the water below threatened to ignite. For hours, the divers cut through bulkhead after bulkhead, sweat pouring down their faces despite the cool water around them. Each time they managed to free a trapped sailor, the cheers from those nearby gave them the strength to keep going. But many of the taps eventually faded into silence. At Hickam Field, the destruction resembled the aftermath of a volcanic eruption. The runways were charred, littered with burned-out shells of aircraft that had once gleamed under the Hawaiian sun. Craters pocked the airfield, each surrounded by scorched earth and twisted fragments of metal. Military trucks rushed to and from the field hospital, carrying the wounded. Men with shrapnel embedded in their skin, men with burns covering their arms and faces, men clutching their stomachs or screaming in agony. Medics moved as fast as they could, but there were too many injured, too many bodies, and not enough hands. At one point, the electricity flickered as generators struggled to keep up. Doctors used lanterns, handheld lamps, even flashlights to operate. They performed surgeries on tables not meant for such purposes, hands shaking but determined, fighting to save anyone they could. Radio operators across the island worked tirelessly, transmitting messages to Washington and to bases across the Pacific. The operators' voices grew hoarse as they repeated calls for reinforcements, for medical supplies, for firefighters, for more rescue boats. Static crackled through the airwaves, sometimes drowning out important details. Commanders on the ground tried to organize what remained of their defenses, unsure whether another wave would come. Some believed the Japanese would soon attempt a landing. Others feared a full-scale invasion of Hawaii. Every soldier who could hold a rifle was mobilized. Machine gun nests were positioned along the beaches, and anti-aircraft guns were readied for another attack. Civilians were told to stay indoors, though many ignored the order and offered their help instead. In the middle of this chaos, Admiral Kimmel stood silently beside a shattered window in his headquarters, staring out at the billowing smoke rising from the harbour. His jaw was clenched, his face pale beneath the soot that had settled on his skin. Each new report of a sinking ship or a rising death toll cut into him like a blade. He replayed the events in his mind: warnings, incomplete intelligence, the decision to cluster the battleships together, the misjudged belief that Pearl Harbor was safe because of distance. Now, as flames consumed the pride of the Pacific Fleet, he knew the blame would haunt him for the rest of his days. News of the attack was slow to reach the mainland, but when it did, the impact was immediate and devastating. Radio announcers' voices trembled as they delivered the first bulletins. The United States naval base at Pearl Harbor has been attacked by Japan. Some listeners dropped whatever they were holding. Others rushed to turn up the volume. Mothers gasped, clasping their hands to their mouths. Fathers stared in disbelief. Children looked at their parents for answers they could not give. The shock spread from house to house, from street to street, until it blanketed the entire nation. Lines formed at recruitment offices before officials even opened the doors. Men of all ages, farmers, mechanics, teachers, students, stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for their chance to enlist. The anger in their eyes told its own story. Pearl Harbor had awakened something powerful. Throughout the night on Oahu, the fires continued to burn. Firefighters, both military and civilian, battled towering flames fueled by oil tanks and ammunition stores that had been struck. The glow from the inferno illuminated the sky like artificial daylight. Every few minutes, a dull boom sounded as another ship's magazine ignited or another fuel tank burst open. Survivors wandered through the rubble, some helping to move debris, others sitting in shock, staring into the flames as if trying to make sense of what had happened. Chaplains prayed over bodies lined up on the docks. Officers searched through lists of the missing, marking names with trembling hands. Divers kept working long after sunset, their lamps casting faint beams through the underwater darkness. They entered compartments filled with debris, reaching out blindly, hoping to find survivors. Some returned with men who clung to them with the last of their strength. Others surfaced with bodies, their faces solemn, their hearts heavy. The harbor that once symbolized American naval strength had become a graveyard. By midnight, the entire world had learned of the attack. In London, Winston Churchill listened to the broadcast in stunned silence before turning slowly toward his advisers. He knew instantly that America, the sleeping giant, had been awakened, and he knew that Japan's victory that morning was not the end, but the beginning of a relentless military response that would eventually reshape the world. And still, on Oahu, the smoldering wrecks of battleships cast long shadows over the harbor as the flames slowly died down. The smoke thinned, drifting upward toward the stars, and in that uneasy calm, the men who survived began to understand that the events of that morning would echo far beyond the waters of Pearl Harbor. They would carry the memory forever, burned into their hearts, their minds, and their nation. As the smoke continued to rise over Pearl Harbor, across the world, the roots of the conflict that had exploded that morning stretched back decades into the ambitions of empires, the arrogance of nations, and the simmering resentments that had been building in Asia long before the first bomb fell on Oahu. To understand why the Japanese pilots had come across thousands of miles of open ocean that day, one had to go back to the time when the world's balance of power still seemed fixed and unquestionable. In the early 1900s, the great European empires, Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, controlled vast territories, carving the world into colonies and spheres of influence with little resistance. The United States was rising, industrializing rapidly, and Japan, a smaller island nation, was watching all of this with growing determination. They wanted their own place among the great powers. They believed they deserved it, and they were willing to fight for it. In those years, Japan transformed itself with astonishing speed. It absorbed Western technology, modernized its navy, expanded its industry, and embraced a fierce mixture of nationalism and militarism. But the world still underestimated them. Western powers viewed Japan with a combination of arrogance and racial condescension, dismissing them as imitators rather than innovators. That perception shattered violently on May 27, 1905, during the Battle of Tsushima, when the Imperial Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. The world gasped. No Asian power had ever defeated a major European empire in the modern era. The victory shocked diplomats, terrified strategists, and uplifted the Japanese people with a sense of destiny. Japan believed its moment had come, but this victory also set into motion events no one fully understood at the time. In the decades that followed, Japan expanded aggressively into Asia. They seized Korea, took Taiwan, and began pressing into China, considered by Western nations as a region under their control. Japan watched as Britain dominated Hong Kong, as France gripped Indochina, and as the United States claimed the Philippines. The Japanese felt boxed in, surrounded by Western empires who controlled the very resources Japan needed to survive. Oil, rubber, iron, and steel, all essential for an industrialized military nation, were not found in abundance on Japan's home islands. For the empire to thrive, it had to expand outward. Inside Japan, politicians argued, generals schemed, admirals drew maps, and a generation of young men was taught that the nation's destiny lay in conquest. Two strategies emerged. The first, the Northern Plan, aimed toward Manchuria and the Soviet Union, where vast fields of oil and minerals tempted the Japanese army. The second, the Southern Plan, focused on the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, and the resource-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies. This plan, favored by the Navy, would bring Japan into direct confrontation with the United States, Britain, and Holland, but it also promised the raw materials the empire desperately needed. Both strategies existed in tension, but the hunger for expansion unified them. Japan's first major step came in 1931 with the Mukden Incident, a staged attack used as a pretext to invade Manchuria. They planted a small explosive on a railway line used by Japanese personnel and blamed Chinese saboteurs. The explosion barely scratched the tracks, yet by morning Japanese forces stormed into Manchuria. Within months the region fell, and Japan set up the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the action but did nothing else. Japan realized something crucial. The world would protest, but it would not act. This emboldened them further. In the years that followed, Japan extended its grip on China, sparking horrific violence that stunned even nations accustomed to the brutality of colonial warfare. Japanese troops marched across Chinese cities, taking what they wanted by force. Resistance was crushed ruthlessly. Civilians suffered atrocities too disturbing to process in real time. Reports trickled out, torture, executions, mass rapes, entire cities burned. Some Westerners living in China witnessed these horrors firsthand. Their letters and photographs would later fuel international outrage, but at the time, outrage alone changed nothing. No military came to stop Japan. No sanctions powerful enough were imposed. As 1937 arrived, tensions erupted into full-scale war at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing. Chinese troops clashed with Japanese forces, and within hours the conflict spiraled out of control. Cities fell, villages burned, refugees fled by the millions. And then came Nanjing, a nightmare carved into history. What happened there would stain Japan's military legacy for generations. An orgy of violence, murder, and cruelty that left tens of thousands dead in the streets. Even hardened war correspondents struggled to describe what they saw. Missionaries sent letters home that read like accounts of hell itself. Yet still, no nation intervened. While Japan marched deeper into China, tensions with Western powers escalated. American diplomats condemned Japanese aggression. British officials protested the attacks on their shipping and interests in China. Yet the United States still sold oil and steel to Japan, feeding the very machine they criticized. American companies profited as Japanese factories turned American scrap metal into bombs and bullets. It was a contradiction that historians would puzzle over for years. Japan used these materials to fuel its military, but the United States, officially neutral, continued trading. Meanwhile, deep inside Tokyo's military headquarters, generals and admirals debated how far Japan could push. The Japanese army, strengthened by victories in China, insisted on pressing northward to challenge the Soviet Union. But in 1939, they met a force they could not break. At the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov crushed the Japanese forces with brutal efficiency. Tanks rolled over positions. Artillery rained down like thunder. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed. The defeat stunned Tokyo. The Northern Plan was quietly abandoned. Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviets in early 1941, freeing their forces to look southward. While Japan recalibrated, Europe plunged into war. Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, France fell in 1940, Britain fought for survival, and suddenly the colonial powers Japan feared most were weakened or distracted. French Indochina was vulnerable. The Dutch East Indies were isolated. British Malaya stood exposed. Japan saw opportunity, a chance to seize resources without having to fight Europeans at full strength. In 1940, Japan moved into northern Indochina, pressuring the French colonial government to allow bases and airfields. The United States responded with embargoes on steel and aviation fuel, warning Japan that further expansion would provoke retaliation. But the embargoes were not enough to stop them. In July 1941, Japan moved into southern Indochina. That was the final straw. The United States froze Japanese assets and imposed a total oil embargo. This terrified Tokyo. Japan imported more than 80% of its oil from the United States. Without oil, its navy would grind to a halt. Its planes could not fly. Its factories would stop. Japan had two choices: yield to American demands or seize the oil it needed by force. The military chose force. But to strike south, Japan had to neutralize one huge threat: the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. If America's battleships and carriers remained intact, any Japanese move toward the Dutch East Indies would be vulnerable to attack. That is when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto entered the picture, an unlikely visionary who understood both Japan's potential and its limitations. He had studied in America. He knew its industrial power, its resources, its population. He warned Japan that even if they succeeded in attacking the United States, they could only win for 6 months to a year. After that, America's factories would drown Japan in ships, guns, and planes. Yet he also knew that if they did nothing, Japan would suffocate under embargo. So he proposed something audacious, something so daring that it seemed impossible: a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to cripple the Pacific Fleet before the United States could respond. Many Japanese generals opposed the plan, fearing the risks, but eventually Yamamoto won. And training began. Japan built full-scale models of Pearl Harbor, pilots practiced low torpedo drops, engineers designed torpedoes that could operate in shallow water. Spies in Honolulu gathered data from tea shops overlooking the harbor, pretending to be tourists while memorizing ship movements. Every detail was studied, every contingency planned. And finally, on November 26, 1941, the Japanese strike force set sail. Their mission: destroy the Pacific Fleet, disable American power in the Pacific, and buy Japan the time it needed to conquer Asia. They believed they could win. They believed destiny was on their side. They believed America would fall to its knees. But they had miscalculated one thing. They had awakened a sleeping giant. As the Japanese fleet crossed the vast silent Pacific, a sense of grim determination settled over every man on board. The carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, moved like silent steel islands, their decks lined with aircraft carefully prepared for the operation that would change world history. There were no radios playing music, no sailors laughing on the decks. Orders were spoken softly, lights were dimmed, silence became a strategy. Wordlessly, men checked their equipment over and over, adjusting oxygen masks, tightening flight suits, polishing goggles, rubbing warmth into their hands as the icy wind cut across the decks. Even the engines of the ship seemed to rumble with restraint, as though they too understood the weight of what was coming. Inside the narrow bunk rooms, some pilots sat with letters from home tucked tightly into their fists. Others sharpened pencils and reviewed maps once more under dim lamps. They traced flight paths repeatedly, committing every angle, every approach, every altitude change to memory. Many had been told the attack could determine Japan's fate. Some were told not to expect to return. A few had written farewell notes already, notes that would be mailed only if they never came home. The youngest among them shuffled nervously, trying to look brave in front of seasoned veterans who pretended not to notice the tremors in their hands. Even Yamamoto, sitting aboard the flagship Nagato far behind the strike force, felt the pressure of sentries bearing down on him. He had crafted this plan with precision, knowing it was Japan's only chance, and yet knowing that even success carried a countdown to inevitable American retaliation. But he also understood the alternative. If Japan did nothing, it would wither slowly under embargo. Either way, a day of reckoning had arrived, and as he stood quietly looking out over the dark sea, he whispered the words he once said years earlier. "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months, but I have no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." It was less a prediction and more a confession. As the fleet drew closer to Hawaii, weather conditions worsened. Waves thrashed against the hulls. Cold winds swept over open decks. But still, the formation pressed on. Each hour brought them closer to the point of no return. Every man aboard felt the tension grow thicker with each passing night. There were no visible landmarks, no islands, nothing but endless dark water stretching in every direction. The aircraft were fueled, armed, and lined up precisely where they needed to be. Mechanics worked silently through the night, tightening bolts, loading torpedoes, and checking bomb fuses with meticulous care. No one dared to speak above a whisper. Far away in Pearl Harbor, the atmosphere could not have been more different. The evening of December 6th passed, like countless peaceful nights before it. Sailors relaxed on deck chairs, playing cards, smoking cigarettes, or writing home. Officers attended social gatherings, house parties, musical performances, even dances. Many had plans for Sunday morning, church services, picnics, leisurely breakfasts. At the airfields, some pilots went to bed early for morning training flights. Others stayed up late, chatting in their barracks or playing poker with fellow airmen. No one suspected that hundreds of miles away, the largest carrier strike force ever assembled was silently approaching them. On Oahu, the city glowed softly under the warm Hawaiian night. Couples walked along the beaches, listening to waves crash gently against the shore. Restaurants buzzed with activity. Radios played big band music. Locals filled theaters and bars, enjoying their weekend. Soldiers at the bases lounged casually, some reading letters from home, others polishing boots for the week ahead. A few men on night shift radar duty scanned their screens with little enthusiasm, expecting another uneventful night shift. The world felt stable, safe, untouchable. But beneath this calm surface, diplomatic messages between Washington and Tokyo grew more tense by the hour. American officials negotiated frantically, hoping to prevent war, but Japan's hardline military leadership had already made its decision. The negotiations were little more than a smokescreen now, something to delay the United States long enough for the attack to strike without warning. By midnight, the Japanese carrier decks were illuminated by faint red lights, carefully shielded from above. Pilots climbed into their cockpits with the precision of ritual. Mechanics pulled chocks from the wheels. Officers shouted final checks. On the flagship Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida reviewed the attack sequences for the last time before closing his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He knew he was about to lead the most consequential strike Japan had ever launched. The battleships at Pearl Harbor slept in the darkness, moored in neat rows like giants at rest. Their decks were quiet, their guns unmanned. They stood as symbols of American naval strength, immense, imposing, unworried. Some sailors were still awake, wandering below deck or sitting quietly outside. Others were fast asleep in their bunks, unaware that fate was already racing toward them at closing speed. At the airfields, rows of American planes glistened under the moonlight. Many were parked tightly together, wings overlapping to prevent sabotage. Ironically, this made them perfect targets for the attack that was coming. Hours before dawn, Fuchida looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the moment. His breath clouded in the freezing air. The engines of the first wave roared to life, cutting through the silence like thunder. One by one, aircraft rolled forward, gathering speed on the carrier decks. Their wheels lifted into the darkness. Then dozens more followed, and then hundreds. Back on the carriers, sailors cheered quietly as the last plane disappeared into the night. The operation was underway. There was no turning back. Either Japan would change the future that morning, or it would sign its own death sentence. As the planes flew toward Hawaii, the pilots could see nothing but black ocean below them. The wind howled across their canopies. Dawn approached slowly, the horizon turning from black to deep blue. And then, far ahead, a faint silhouette of land began to emerge through the mist. Oahu, Diamond Head, Pearl Harbor. Fuchida looked down and saw the harbor just beginning to glow in the first light of morning. Battleships lined the water. Airfields stretched across the landscape. The sky was clear. There was no alarm, no defensive movement, no activity. It was the perfect moment. Fuchida leaned forward, gripping the mic, and shouted the words that would echo forever through history. Tora! 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 The signal for total surprise. And with that single transmission, the world changed. The moment Fuchida's voice crackled through the radio, sending the coded message, Tora! 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 across the sky, every Japanese pilot understood instantly that history had opened its jaws. They had achieved total surprise. Now nothing stood between them and the American fleet, sleeping beneath the morning sun. The first wave tightened formation as it swept low over the water, engines screaming, sunlight flashing across their wings like sparks off a blade. Fuchida looked down again and saw the rows of American battleships glimmering like steel mountains resting peacefully in the harbor. It struck him how calm everything seemed below, how ordinary, how undeserving of the violence about to fall upon it. He felt the tremble of anticipation inside his gut, the mingling of duty, adrenaline, and an odd sense of tragedy. But there was no room for hesitation. He raised his hand and gave the command for the attack to begin. A few seconds later, the first bombs were released. They fell like black seeds from the sky, whistling as gravity pulled them towards the decks of battleships that had no idea death was descending upon them. The first explosion tore through the morning with a thunderous roar, ripping apart the quiet and shattering Pearl Harbor's illusions of safety. Fire and smoke erupted upward, creating a monstrous column that billowed into the sky. Sailors jolted from their sleep, confused and dazed, many thinking at first that it was some kind of drill or accidental explosion. But the second and third blasts quickly made it clear this was no accident. This was war. On the USS Arizona, men scrambled out of their bunks, rushing toward ladders and hatches, some still pulling on clothes, others barefoot and shirtless as they ran. Officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the thunder of incoming bombs. Anti-aircraft gunners sprinted to their stations, yanking off covers and loading ammunition as quickly as their shaking hands allowed. Across the harbor, the USS Oklahoma groaned as 3 torpedoes slammed into her hull almost simultaneously, sending shivers through the water and tipping the ship violently to one side. Water flooded in so fast that men barely had time to react before entire compartments went dark, sealing dozens inside. Sailors clung to railings as the deck tilted beneath their feet. Some jumped into the oily water below, desperate to escape before the ship rolled completely. Within minutes, the Oklahoma began capsizing, its massive hull rising out of the water like a dying leviathan. Screams echoed from inside the ship as trapped men pounded on the steel walls, hoping someone, anyone, would hear them. On the decks of nearby vessels, sailors stared helplessly at the sight, feeling the horrifying weight of powerlessness. Above them, Japanese dive bombers wheeled sharply, descending with shrill, terrifying cries. Their sirens were designed to psychologically break enemies, and at Pearl Harbor they achieved their purpose. The bombers swooped down like mechanical hawks, releasing payload after payload with deadly precision. Each strike sent columns of fire spiraling into the air. Fuchida directed the attack from above, circling the harbor and calling out adjustments to pilots below. His voice remained steady despite the chaos, but inside, even he felt overwhelmed by the scale of destruction unfolding beneath him. At the airfields, the disaster was equally devastating. At Wheeler, Hickam, and Bellows Fields, rows of American fighter planes lined up wingtip to wingtip became perfect targets. Japanese Zero fighters strafed them mercilessly, bullets tearing through metal, fuel tanks igniting instantly, flames spreading across the tarmac like wildfire. Pilots ran desperately from barracks to their aircraft, only to find them already burning or exploding before their eyes. Some tried using rifles to shoot into the sky, their rounds falling hopelessly short of the altitude of attacking aircraft. Inside the barracks at Hickam Field, walls rattled as bombs detonated outside. Men crawled through smoke-filled hallways, some dragging injured comrades, others coughing violently as dust and debris filled their lungs. Those who managed to reach the outside faced a nightmare landscape of flaming planes, twisted metal, and bodies everywhere. The attack was so sudden, so overwhelming, that even experienced soldiers struggled to process what was happening. Meanwhile, destroyers and smaller vessels tried desperately to maneuver or escape the harbor. The USS helm swung around sharply, engines roaring as the crew attempted to fight back against incoming torpedo planes. The ship's gunners fired blindly into the sky, trying to hit anything with wings. Nearby, the mine-layer USS Oglala shuddered violently as an explosion ripped through her hull, causing her to list heavily. Sailors frantically laid pumps and hoses, trying to keep the ship afloat, but every effort seemed futile as Japanese fighters repeatedly strafed the decks, sending men diving for cover. The USS Helena, mistaken in the early chaos for a battleship, took a torpedo that tore through her side and sent shockwaves through the harbor. Men and debris were flung into the air. The force of the blast ruptured the hull of the nearby Oglala, sealing its fate, and still more Japanese planes descended upon the harbor. Aboard the USS Nevada, Ensign Tighe made the decision that would become one of the most dramatic moments of the attack. Acting quickly, he ordered additional boilers lit, knowing that if the Nevada could get underway, it might escape the catastrophic fate of the other battleships pinned to their moorings. Men sprinted below deck, throwing open valves, stoking fires, pushing the engines to life. Black smoke billowed from the funnels as the Nevada slowly began to move, pulling away from Battleship Row under intense fire. As the ship lumbered forward, Japanese pilots noticed it immediately. They understood the strategic significance. If the Nevada escaped, it would become a symbol of American resilience rather than defeat. Dozens of planes from the second wave dove towards the moving battleship, dropping bombs with ruthless precision. Explosions hammered the deck, sending fires erupting across the ship. Still, the Nevada pushed forward, refusing to stop. Sailors fought flames with hoses as black smoke engulfed them. Finally, when the damage became too extensive and the risk of sinking in the narrow channel too high, the order was given to beach the ship at Hospital Point. With help from tugboats and smaller craft, the Nevada ran aground in shallow waters. She was scarred, burning, battered, but she had survived. Across the harbor, the greatest tragedy unfolded aboard the USS Arizona. A massive armor-piercing bomb struck near the forward magazines, penetrating deep before detonating. The explosion that followed was so violent it lifted the ship out of the water, creating a fireball that illuminated the harbor like a miniature sun. The steel hull split open. Most of the crew never had a chance to escape. Flames shot dozens of meters into the air. The blast reverberated across Oahu, shaking buildings miles away. Men on other ships froze in shock as the Arizona's remains sank into the harbor, burning fiercely, a horrifying sight they would never forget. In the skies above, Japanese pilots could hardly believe the scale of destruction below them. The harbor was a cauldron of smoke, flame, and black water filled with oil. Ships burned everywhere. Men swam desperately through the slick, their heads barely visible amid the wreckage. Fuchida radioed in the results with an almost conflicted sense of awe. The attack was succeeding beyond expectations, but even he, hardened by years of war planning, felt a momentary heaviness watching battleships erupt like volcanoes. As the second wave arrived, American anti-aircraft fire intensified. Gunners now had their bearings. They fired relentlessly into the sky, filling it with shrapnel. Japanese pilots in the second wave faced much greater resistance, and many were shot down. Smoke made visibility nearly impossible. Flames on the water created boiling pockets that pilots had to avoid during low passes. The second wave was punished heavily, but they still inflicted massive additional damage, shattering dry docks, destroying more aircraft, and sending more cruisers and destroyers into flames. Finally, after nearly 2 relentless hours, the attack drew to a close. The last Japanese aircraft circled the harbor, recording damage before turning back toward the distant carriers. Some pilots looked down and saw burning ships, capsized hulls, plumes of smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. Others saw men waving white shirts and flags from the water, begging for rescue. Some felt triumph, others felt unease. None fully grasped the storm they had unleashed. As they returned to their carriers, they expected to refuel and launch a third wave. But Admiral Nagumo, after reviewing the situation, made the controversial decision to withdraw. He feared a third wave would suffer heavy losses and might leave the fleet vulnerable to American carriers, which were still missing. The pilots were shocked. Many believed victory was incomplete without destroying dry docks, repair facilities, and fuel reserves. But Nagumo would not risk Japan's entire carrier force. While the Japanese fleet retreated into the vast Pacific back at Pearl Harbor, the horror had only just begun. Sailors dove repeatedly into burning waters to rescue trapped men. Wreckage floated everywhere. Oil fires burned on the surface, forcing rescuers to swim underwater to avoid flames. On capsized ships like the Oklahoma, faint banging could be heard from inside, survivors tapping desperately against the hull. Rescue teams rushed with cutting torches and equipment, trying to reach them before oxygen ran out. The air was thick with smoke, the smell of burning oil, and the cries of wounded men. Doctors worked tirelessly, converting mess halls into makeshift hospitals. Nurses moved from patient to patient, their uniforms stained with blood and soot. Medics performed surgeries on decks still slick from fire hoses, often without anesthesia. Chaplains moved among the dying, offering final prayers. Above the devastation, Roosevelt's message traveled through the night toward Washington. His calm exterior barely masked his fury. Japan had not just attacked, it had attacked without declaration, without warning, while diplomats still shook hands in Washington. The next day, he stood before Congress and spoke the words that would define a generation. December the 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. America had been shaken awake, and the Pacific would never be the same. As smoke continued to rise over Oahu like a dark plague hanging in the sky, the full scope of the catastrophe slowly revealed itself to the stunned American forces picking through the ruins. Fires still roared from the shattered remains of battleships. Clouds of black oil drifted across the harbor's surface, thick and suffocating. Bodies floated between the debris. The once calm morning waters had transformed into an inferno of twisted steel and human tragedy. Every man who walked those decks realized instantly that the United States had been thrust into a war it never intended to enter, and the price of that unpreparedness lay everywhere at their feet. On Ford Island, sailors formed bucket lines, frantically shoveling water into flames that refused to die. Others crawled into half-submerged compartments, searching for trapped survivors. Welders and engineers rushed between wrecks, torches in hand, cutting through hulls that were still hot to the touch. When they reached the USS Oklahoma, now lying upside down, they began tapping on the hull, listening desperately for replies from inside. Hours later, faint tapping came back. Men were alive in pockets of air deep within the overturned battleship. There was no time to waste. As rescue teams worked, other sailors stood silently on decks, staring at ships that had once been symbols of American power. Some cried openly, others clenched their fists until their knuckles turned white. A few stared blankly at the horizon, numb from what they had witnessed. For many, the world had ended and restarted in the space of 2 hours. Inside the burning remains of the USS Arizona, the heat was so intense that recovery teams could barely approach. Flames licked upward from the ruins, fueled by thousands of gallons of fuel oil still leaking from ruptured tanks. Some sailors attempted to reach the bodies of friends still visible on the scorched deck, but officers pulled them away, knowing the Arizona could explode again at any moment. The wreck had become a tomb, and everyone understood it. On the shores of Pearl Harbor, civilians emerged from their homes in disbelief. Women clutched their children, staring at the sky as distant columns of smoke twisted like dark serpents. The sound of explosions still echoed faintly, even after the attack had ended. Some families drove towards the base, hoping to find loved ones, only to be turned back by guards shaken to their core. No one was allowed through, not yet. In hospitals and makeshift triage stations, doctors worked with unbroken intensity. They moved from one wounded man to another, assessing burns, shrapnel wounds, crushed limbs, smoke inhalation. Supplies ran dangerously low. Nurses ripped sheets into bandages when cotton ran out. Blood pooled on floors. The air was thick with cries, some pleading for help, others calling out names that would never be answered again. At the Naval Communications Center, telegraph operators transmitted frantic messages to Washington. Some were incomplete, choked with static. Others were painfully clear. Battleships burning, multiple sunk, heavy loss of life, situation catastrophic. The news reached the White House shortly after noon in Washington, D.C. President Roosevelt sat in his study, surrounded by advisors, when the knock at the door came. Secretary of the Navy, Frank. Knox entered, pale and breathless. He leaned in and delivered the words that froze the room. "Mr. President, Pearl Harbor is under attack." Roosevelt remained motionless for several seconds. Then his jaw tightened. He knew immediately that diplomacy had ended. The negotiations, the cables, the back and forth with Japanese diplomats, it had all been a diversion to buy time. Japan had made its choice. Now America had no choice but to answer. Throughout the afternoon, updates poured in. Battleships sunk, aircraft destroyed, casualties climbing into the thousands. Every report hit the president like a blow. The weight of the lives lost was not just military, it was personal. He had met sailors stationed in Hawaii. He knew officers by name. Now many were gone. Roosevelt dictated messages with calm precision, but inside anger churned. Japan had struck without warning, without declaration, not only attacking American territory, but attacking during peace negotiations. It was a betrayal, calculated and cold. Across the Pacific, in Tokyo, radio broadcasts crackled with celebration. Crowds gathered in the streets, waving flags and chanting victory slogans. The military leadership radiated confidence. Newspapers rushed to print triumphant headlines. Imperial forces smash American fleet. Japan achieves glorious victory. But behind these public displays, some officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Yamamoto's warnings. They knew America's industrial power. Some even doubted whether the attack had truly crippled the US beyond repair. But for the moment, the atmosphere in Tokyo was jubilant. A nation convinced destiny was on its side. Back in Hawaii, meanwhile, the adrenaline of the attack gave way to quiet horror as daylight faded and the full devastation became visible. Smoke hung thick in the air, darkening the sunset into a sickened red. Fires still burned across the harbor. The silhouette of the Arizona glowed faintly under the flames, a haunting reminder of the morning's fury. Phones rang constantly in Navy offices as families tried desperately to reach loved ones. Clerks worked through the night compiling casualty lists. Chaplains moved from room to room, offering comfort to wives, mothers, and children who had rushed to the base gates only to be told nothing could be confirmed. Many families waited for news that would never come. In barracks across the base, sailors who had survived the attack sat together in silence. Some stared at the ground, hands trembling uncontrollably. Others paced restlessly, unable to sit still, haunted by the sight of friends dying beside them. A few spoke quietly, recounting the moment they saw their ship explode or the moment they dove into the water to escape the flames. But for the most part, words felt insufficient. The experience had hardened them in mere hours. Many felt older, colder, changed. Throughout the night, teams continued to cut through the hull of the capsized Oklahoma. The tapping from inside grew weaker. Welders worked until sparks burned their arms. They knew every second mattered. One sailor shouted through a small opening, "Hold on, boys, we're coming." A faint voice answered back, but it was getting harder to hear. At 2:01 a.m., Roosevelt finished drafting the speech he would give to Congress the next day. He read it aloud softly. "A date which will live in infamy." He paused. The room fell silent. The words captured everything: anger, betrayal, shock, and resolve. He would deliver them with the weight of every life lost in that harbor. When dawn broke over Washington the next day, crowds filled the streets. Radio stations replayed emergency bulletins. Newspapers delivered extra editions with grim headlines. Across the country, men lined up at recruitment offices before they even opened. Many had never left their hometowns before, but now they demanded to fight. Now they demanded justice. Roosevelt addressed Congress at 12:30 p.m. The chamber was so packed that many stood in aisles just to hear him. His voice, though aged by the weight of recent hours, carried a power that electrified the room. When he declared that war existed between the United States and Japan, the chamber erupted in applause. Only one representative, Jeannette Rankin, voted against the declaration, holding on to her pacifist convictions even as the nation roared for war. In Tokyo, the news of America's declaration swept through government circles. Some officials were surprised by how quickly Congress acted. Others dismissed the significance, believing that America, divided, isolated, unprepared, would take years to become a full threat. Yamamoto, however, understood the truth. He had studied America. He had lived there. He knew what was coming. Quietly, almost to himself, he murmured the words that would echo through future history. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." In Hawaii, while Washington mobilized, the grim work continued. Salvage crews ventured into half-sunken compartments, looking for survivors or remains. Divers swam into flooded hulls, where visibility dropped to zero, feeling along walls for bodies in the dark. Many emerged shaken, unable to speak of what they had seen. Others vomited on the decks from the mixture of oil fumes, smoke, and grief. Civilians on Oahu formed volunteer groups, delivering blankets, food, and clothing to sailors who had lost everything. Churches opened their doors to the homeless. Local communities banded together in solidarity, unlike anything they had experienced before. For the first time, the people of Hawaii and the U.S. military felt stitched together by shared suffering. By the third day, American newspapers across the nation printed lists of ships sunk, planes lost, and names missing. Families gathered around kitchen tables in fear and sorrow. Portraits of young sailors hung on walls. Mothers wept silently. Fathers stared at newspapers with trembling hands. Children asked questions their parents could not answer, but mixed with the grief was something else: fury, determination. a collective resolve that swept through the country like wildfire. Factories began retooling immediately. Assembly lines converted from consumer goods to weapons. Ordinary men and women entered industrial jobs, often working 12-hour shifts. Recruiters traveled from town to town, rallying volunteers. America was becoming something new, an awakened rival unlike anything Japan had yet faced. Across the ocean, Yamamoto studied intelligence reports from Pearl Harbor. He knew the attack had caused tremendous destruction, but he also knew the carriers, the true backbone of American naval power, had escaped. This fact troubled him deeply. Carriers were mobile, unpredictable, and capable of striking across vast distances. Their survival meant the Pacific would soon become a battlefield of roaming fleets and aerial duels. He sensed that Japan's 6-month window was already ticking. In the months that followed, Japan swept through Southeast Asia with lightning speed, capturing territories rich in oil and resources. Their victories seemed unstoppable. Tokyo boasted that its empire would last 1,000 years. But deep within Yamamoto's heart, uncertainty lingered. He had warned his commanders, Japan must win quickly or not at all. And Pearl Harbor, while spectacular, had not destroyed America's foundation. It had only enraged it. The people of the United States, united in grief and fury, began preparing for a war larger than anything the world had seen. Young men enlisted in millions. Women entered factories in record numbers. Shipyards launched vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Aircraft plants churned out fighters and bombers at unprecedented rates. The sleeping giant was not only awake, he was growing stronger by the hour. And as America mobilized, the memory of Pearl Harbor became its heartbeat. A promise, a wound, a fire that demanded justice. The Pacific would soon witness battles of unimaginable scale: Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But the spark that ignited them all had risen over Pearl Harbor on a quiet Sunday morning when the world changed forever. In the weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States moved with a speed and determination Japan had never anticipated. The shock of that Sunday morning still echoed through American cities, town squares and family homes. But the shock had hardened into something else: purpose. What Japan believed would be a crippling blow had instead become a unifying force. Recruitment offices overflowed with men demanding to serve. Older veterans from World War I volunteered to return. Teenagers lied about their age to enlist. Women stepped into roles previously closed to them, welding steel plates, riveting aircraft frames, stitching uniforms, working late shifts in factories that glowed through the night. America was awakening, and its awakening was thunderous. While the United States mobilized, Japan surged across the Pacific like a rising tide. Their attack had not been limited to Pearl Harbor. Within hours, Japanese forces struck simultaneously across multiple fronts: Hong Kong, Malaya, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. Each assault was meticulously planned, each strike aimed to cripple Allied defenses before they could rally. Japan's military, believing itself unstoppable, moved with ruthless efficiency. Airfields were bombed, harbors seized, and coastal defenses overwhelmed. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur faced an invasion force that outnumbered and outgunned his troops. The Japanese advance pushed relentlessly down the Bataan Peninsula. American and Filipino soldiers fought bravely, often with dwindling ammunition and limited supplies. But the Japanese offensive seemed endless. After months of desperate resistance, the defenders of Bataan were forced to surrender. What followed was a nightmare: the Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walk over 60 miles under the scorching sun with no food, no water, and savage beatings for those who faltered. Thousands died on the roadside, their bodies left where they fell. News of the march trickled back to America, further fueling a determination for justice. In Southeast Asia, Japanese forces swept through Malaya with such speed that British commanders could hardly comprehend the scale of their defeat. Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress, fell after a mere 7 days of fighting. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill called it the greatest disaster in British military history. Japan captured vast territories rich in oil, rubber, and minerals, resources they desperately needed for war. Tokyo celebrated, newspapers boasting that the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere had become reality almost overnight. But Japan's rapid expansion carried seeds of overconfidence. Many officers believed the Americans would lose heart or sue for peace. They misread America's resolve entirely. Far from losing heart, the United States was planning its first strike back, a mission so audacious, so seemingly impossible, that even seasoned commanders doubted it could succeed. The plan came from the mind of Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle, a brilliant aviator and strategist. His idea was risk on the edge of madness, launch medium bombers, large, land-based B-25 Mitchells, from the deck of an aircraft carrier, something no one had ever attempted. The target would be Japan itself, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Japan's heartland, not for strategic destruction, but for something psychological. To show Japan that Pearl Harbor had not broken America, that America could reach them, that nowhere was safe. The USS Hornet was chosen for the mission. Its deck was packed with 16 B-25 bombers, their wings barely fitting, their tails hanging over the edge. Training was intense. Pilots learned how to lift off in just a few hundred feet. Mechanics stripped weight from the aircraft, guns removed, equipment replaced, every ounce counted. The bomber crews understood the danger. Even if they reached Japan, there was no way back to the carrier. Their only hope was to continue west and land in China. If fuel ran out, they would crash. If captured, they faced torture or execution. Still, every man volunteered without hesitation. On April 18, 1942, the Doolittle raid launched earlier than planned after Japanese patrol boats spotted the American task force. The sea was rough, winds lashed the deck. The carriers pitched violently, making takeoff even more dangerous, but the mission could not be called off. Roosevelt wanted Japan to know that the United States was not beaten. The world needed to know it too. Doolittle stepped onto the deck at dawn, tightened his harness, and signaled his crew. Engines roared. The bomber lurched forward on the narrow deck, gathering speed, fighting the wind. For a moment, it seemed the wheels might not lift. Then the nose tipped upward, and the aircraft rose into the air, clearing the waves by mere feet. One by one, the other bombers followed, leaping into the vast sky. Hours later, they reached Japan. Air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo as the first American bombs fell. Though the physical damage was limited, the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's military had promised that its home islands were untouchable. The Doolittle raiders shattered that illusion. They ignited fires, blasted factories, and sent civilians running through the streets. The Japanese government was stunned. Panic rippled through Tokyo's leadership. They demanded answers. How had American planes reached them? From where? Furious and humiliated, Japan vowed retaliation. But their response would not strike America. It would strike China, which had aided the raiders. Entire villages were burned. Tens of thousands of civilians were massacred. It was one of the darkest reprisals of the war, born of rage and wounded pride. Back in America, the Doolittle raid electrified the nation. Newspapers celebrated the pilots as heroes. Crowds cheered their names. Roosevelt became a symbol of strength. The strike had not crippled Japan, but it had delivered a message. The United States would not fight this war on its knees. It would stand. It would strike back. But while the raid lifted spirits, it also triggered a chain reaction in Japan's strategic thinking, and that reaction would lead directly to the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. Japan's leaders, fearing further attacks on their home islands, concluded that the only way to secure their perimeter was to eliminate the remaining American aircraft carriers. Pearl Harbor had damaged battleships, but the carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, had escaped. In the new age of naval warfare, carriers were the true kings of the ocean, and unless they were destroyed, Japan could never guarantee the safety of its empire. Admiral Yamamoto devised a plan that he believed would remove the threat once and for all. Its centerpiece was Midway, a small atoll in the Central Pacific strategically positioned like a doorway to Hawaii. If Japan captured Midway and destroyed America's carriers in the battle that followed, the Pacific would fall under Japan's control. The United States would be pushed back to California. Japan's empire would be secure. Yamamoto believed that by attacking Midway, he could lure the American fleet into the open. He envisioned a massive trap, using his carrier forces as bait. The American ships, enraged by Pearl Harbor and desperate to strike back, would rush straight into the jaws of his ambush. Once they arrived, Japanese carrier aircraft would annihilate them, just as they had destroyed the battleships at Pearl Harbor. But Yamamoto didn't know one crucial detail. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval communications. Inside a cramped basement in Pearl Harbor, cryptologists worked day and night analyzing Japanese codebooks. One of them, Commander Joseph Rochefort, made the breakthrough. He discovered that AF, a coded location repeatedly mentioned in Japanese communications, referred to Midway. To confirm it, the Americans tricked Japan into revealing the truth. They ordered Midway to send an uncoded message complaining about a water shortage. Hours later, Japanese communications reported that AF is short on water. The trap was revealed. The Americans now knew exactly where and when Japan would strike. This single piece of intelligence changed everything. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, realized that the United States could turn Japan's trap against them. Instead of rushing blindly into battle, the Americans would position their carriers north of Midway, hidden and waiting. When the Japanese carriers launched their first attack, thinking they held the advantage, American aircraft would strike back with devastating timing. But to make this plan work, the Americans needed every ship they had, including the severely damaged USS Yorktown, which had barely survived the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier. The carrier limped into Pearl Harbor, with fires still smoldering and gaping holes in her decks. Navy engineers told Nimitz repairs would take 3 months. He gave them 3 days. Shipyard workers swarmed over the carrier like ants, welding, hammering, riveting, replacing plates, repairing engines, planes, and flight decks. Sparks flew through the night. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion. Nurses brought coffee and sandwiches to keep them going. Against all odds, the Yorktown was repaired in 72 hours, just enough for her to sail into what would become one of the most critical battles in history. As the American carriers moved quietly into position north of Midway, tensions rose among the crews. Pilots cleaned their goggles repeatedly, checked weapons, folded maps, studied flight plans. Many had never faced combat before. Others had survived Coral Sea and knew exactly how brutal carrier battles could be. The ocean below them was calm, deceptively calm, hiding the violence that would soon erupt. On the Japanese side, Yamamoto's plan moved forward with confidence. His fleet was vast, his pilots experienced, his carriers powerful. The Japanese strike force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, sailed arrogantly toward Midway, believing themselves unbeatable. After Pearl Harbor, after months of sweeping victory, after humiliating the Allies again and again, why wouldn't they believe it? But they were sailing into a battlefield they could no longer fully control. The fate of the Pacific would be decided at Midway. The tide of war was about to shift forever. The morning sun rose over the Pacific on June the 4th, 1942, casting golden light across the endless expanse of water. Beneath that calm surface, hidden far beyond the horizon, 2 of the greatest naval forces in history prepared for a confrontation that would decide the future of the world. The Japanese fleet moved in with supreme confidence. Their admirals believed the Americans were still reeling, that the carriers from Pearl Harbor's absence had weakened them beyond repair. Yamamoto himself envisioned this as the knockout blow America would never recover from. But he didn't know that 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were already positioned to meet him. On the tiny atoll of Midway, Marines manned anti-aircraft guns with trembling hands. Pilots sat in cockpits sweating despite the morning chill. Mechanics pushed fuel lines, yelling orders over the roar of engines. They knew what was coming. The Japanese bombers appeared as dark specks on the horizon before exploding into view, glittering formations that blotted out the sun. Sirens wailed across the island. Men rushed to foxholes. Gunners spun their barrels upward, and the sky lit up in chaos. Japanese dive bombers plummeted toward Midway with terrifying precision, each pilot determined to break American defenses. Explosions rocked the ground, sending sand and debris spraying into the air. Oil tanks erupted into pillars of flame, hangars collapsed, equipment burned. But despite the ferocity of the attack, Midway refused to fall. Anti-aircraft guns spat fire into the sky, bringing down bomber after bomber. Pilots inside falling aircraft screamed prayers into their radios before disappearing into the sea. Far out at sea, American scout planes searching the horizon finally spotted the Japanese carriers. A breathless pilot's voice crackled over the radio. Enemy carriers sighted. Repeat, enemy carriers sighted. On the decks of the US carriers, squadrons scrambled to take off. Pilots rushed to their planes, climbing into tight cockpits as crews removed wheel chocks, engines roared, propellers blurred. The carriers turned into the wind. One by one, American aircraft leapt into the sky. What followed was chaos in its purest form. American torpedo squadrons were the first to find the Japanese fleet. Flying low and slow, carrying heavy weapons, they were easy targets. Japanese Zero fighters tore into them mercilessly. Torpedo planes burst into flames, smoke trailing behind as they plunged into the sea. Many didn't even get close enough to release their torpedoes. Entire squadrons were wiped out. Only a handful of pilots survived. Their sacrifice seemed in vain, but their deaths bought time, precious minutes, minutes that would shape history. At 10:22 a.m., with Japanese fighters still chasing the last torpedo planes, a new sound emerged from above, high-pitched, growing louder. Japanese sailors looked up. Out of the sun, diving at incredible speed, came American SBD Dauntless dive bombers. They had arrived at the perfect moment, with Japanese flight decks cluttered with fuel hoses, bombs, and rearming aircraft. Because the admirals had switched attack plans mid-strike, the carriers were giant floating powder kegs. The first Dauntless bombers dove straight toward the cargo. Bombs fell like lightning. One hit the flight deck. A second blasted through the hangar. A third struck the forward section. In moments, the cargo erupted into a massive inferno, flames shooting dozens of meters high. On the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood frozen as an American bomb smashed through the deck and exploded inside the ship, igniting fuel tanks and exploding aircraft. Flames roared across the flagship, consuming everything in their path. Orders became shouts, then screams. Sailors hurled themselves overboard as the ship became an ocean of fire. On the Soryu, more bombs found their mark. Explosions tore through the hangars, tossing aircraft like toys. Fuel ignited. Crews ran desperately with hoses that melted in their hands. Black smoke engulfed the ship as the deck collapsed inward. 3 of Japan's 4 first-line carriers were burning uncontrollably within minutes. The entire course of the war shifted in the space of 5 heartbeats. Only the Hiryu survived the initial strikes, and she retaliated with fury. Her bombers located the Yorktown and struck with surgical precision. Bombs tore into her deck, torpedoes smashed into her hull. Flames spread across her interior, but the Yorktown's crew fought with desperate courage, extinguishing fires and stabilizing the ship against all odds. When Japanese pilots returned, believing her to be a new target, they struck again, unaware it was the same carrier they had already hit. This time the damage was too severe. Yorktown began to list. Her crew abandoned her reluctantly, many weeping as they climbed into lifeboats. But before the Hiryu could continue her onslaught, American dive bombers found her. They struck with the same brutal precision as earlier, sending firestorms rolling across the last Japanese carrier. Within hours, she too was sinking. 4 Japanese carriers, 4 symbols of their naval might, were gone. Midway became not a battle, but a turning of the tide, a shattering blow Japan would never recover from. Yamamoto, receiving the news aboard his flagship far to the rear, sat in silence. His plan, his confidence, his warnings, all now washed away in the cold reality of the Pacific Ocean. The 6 months he once predicted were over, and his nation's fate had sealed itself in fire. From that day forward, the United States surged across the Pacific with unstoppable momentum. American industry roared like a machine awakened. New carriers rolled out of shipyards faster than Japan could replace a single one. Aircraft swarmed from factory lines. Soldiers trained in vast camps. The Pacific War turned into a relentless march westward. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each island was won through blood, sacrifice, and the unshakable determination of a nation united by the memory of Pearl Harbor. On April 18, 1943, American cryptologists intercepted Yamamoto's travel plans. In a precise aerial ambush over Bougainville, his transport plane was shot down. The architect of Pearl Harbor died in the jungle, fulfilling his own prophecy. By 1945, Japan was surrounded, starving, bombed, burning, yet its military leadership refused to surrender. The United States made a choice it had never wanted to make. On August the 6th, a single American bomber dropped the first atomic weapon over Hiroshima, turning the city into a storm of fire and ash. 3 days later, Nagasaki endured the same fate. The world entered a new age of fear and power. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan formally surrendered. The war was over. Millions were dead, cities destroyed, empire shattered, and at the heart of it all, the echo of that first strike on Pearl Harbor still lingered. For the United States, Pearl Harbor became more than a moment. It became a vow. A vow that surprise would never cripple the nation again. A vow that its military would remain vigilant. A vow that sacrifice would always be remembered. Steel rusts, ships sink. But memory does not fade. The wreck of the USS Arizona still rests beneath the calm waters of Pearl Harbor, oil drops rising slowly to the surface like tears that never stop falling. Visitors stand above the sunken battleship, listening to silence heavy with the weight of history. They look down at the remains of men who never saw the war they helped ignite. And every December 7th, the nation pauses, not just to remember the dead, but to remember the moment the world changed forever. The flames of Pearl Harbor forged a generation, a war, a superpower, and in that fire, America rose from ashes, stronger, determined, unbreakable. The story of Pearl Harbor is not a story of defeat. It is a story of awakening, a reminder that even in the darkest hour, hope can rise, that courage can endure, that freedom, once challenged, will always find its defenders. And so the legacy lives on, carried by history, carved into memory, and echoed in every promise made by those who still stand watch across oceans far from home.